Thank you for the warm welcome. I'd like to talk about very serious problems that we're facing right here at home. But for a little perspective, I would like to start with some very important events that are taking place right now, far away, in an area of the world where the United States has been intensely involved for a long time and surely will continue to be. Right at this moment, there are massive demonstrations taking place in Egypt, mostly young people, many thousands of people in the streets facing police brutality, protesting the terror and venality of the dictatorship which the U.S. strongly supports. This is the first of the anticipated spillovers from what's been going on in Tunisia in the past days. Very impressive democratic movement in a I'm quoting, in a police state with little freedom of expression or association and serious human rights problems, ruled by a dictator whose family is hated by the population for the corruption and the brutality of the family regime. Well, as perhaps you know, I'm quoting the U.S. ambassador in a secret cable that was released by WikiLeaks. Shortly after the cable arrived in Washington, the government provided substantial military aid to the Tunisian dictatorship that the ambassador had described. Tunisia was one of 5 foreign beneficiaries of that grant of aid, Israel routinely, and 2 other Middle Eastern dictatorships, along with Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan. And the 5th was Colombia, the country that has long held the prize for the worst human rights record in the hemisphere and has been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid throughout this whole period in the hemisphere. A correlation that generalizes, unfortunately. Well, there's a guiding principle in this and many other cases. It was articulated clearly a couple of days ago by Marwan Mouasher. He's a Carnegie Endowment Middle East specialist, former high official of the Jordanian government. He's reacting to what was happening in Tunisia. He says, the traditional argument put forward in and out of the Arab world is that there's nothing wrong, everything is under control. He's quite correct, and the argument generalizes far beyond the Arab world. It generalizes to the domestic scene in the United States as well. Right now, in fact, if the population is sufficiently passive and obedient, everything's fine. Doesn't matter what else is happening. The guiding principle is that the powerful should try to gain their ends by any feasible means, supporting harsh dictatorships in the current Middle East case, and that's fine. One can ignore the popular will as long as the population's kept under control. And the pattern's quite general and very significant for us in a number of ways. One I've mentioned, namely the guiding principle applies right here to us. So obviously significant for us. And it has indeed throughout American history. I'll return to that. Another reason is that this guiding principle, this contempt for the population as long as they're under control and reliance on dictatorships, is a very direct and serious security threat to us. It's a root cause of the terror that Washington is theoretically seeking to combat but in reality is consistently stimulating by pursuing this guiding principle. Incidentally, that's also at the root of the huge military budget of the U.S., about the same as the rest of the world combined, strangling the economy. Half of the famous deficit, the other half of the famous deficit, which Mr. Obama will be talking about in the State of the Union message, and I'm sure won't mention. The other half of the deficit is the totally dysfunctional privatized healthcare system, about twice the per capita costs of any other of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. If we had a health system of the kind that comparable countries have, there would be no deficit, and probably there would indeed be a surplus. Well, going back to the root cause of terror, you'll recall, I'm sure, after 9/11, President Bush declared that they committed the terrorist crimes because they hate our freedoms. Shortly after that, a major Pentagon study group, the Defense Science Board, reacted to President Bush's comment in a report. Like others who know anything about the history and the current circumstances of the region, they concluded, I'm quoting them, that Muslims do not hate our freedom, quoting Bush, but rather they hate our policies. When American public diplomacy talks about bringing democracy to Islamic societies, this is seen as no more than self-serving hypocrisy. These views, incidentally, are quite conventional, among specialists at least, who also understand that these U.S. policies are a gift to the extremists among the jihadis. General consensus on this is formulated clearly by David Gardner. He's Middle East correspondent of the world's leading business daily, the Financial Times, many years of experience in the region, books and so on. He says, so long as the jihadis can rely on the United States to stand by its Arab allies, such as the House of Saud and President Mubarak of Egypt, then the bin Laden franchise's monstrous bet that it can foment a class of civilizations may be evil, but is not wholly mad. If we continue to connive in the survival of tyranny, we abet the onward march of the jihadis, for whom Western policy is their most consistently reliable ally. That same observation was made by Michael Scheuer, who for many years was in charge of tracking bin Laden for the CIA. He concludes that the United States of America remains bin Laden's only indispensable ally, and that remains true. Obama is a very strong supporter of the House of Saud and the Egyptian dictator who's now under siege in Cairo and Alexandria. The insights are by no means new. This is all old hat. In 1958, President Eisenhower, in internal discussion since declassified, he consulted with his staff on what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not among the governments, who are mostly supportive, but among the people. It was pretty striking in 1958, because just shortly before, Eisenhower had intervened to force Israel, France, and England out of the Sinai, which they had conquered, an act of aggression. But instead of gratitude, there was a campaign of hatred. About the same time, the National Security Council, top planning body, released a report in which they explained the campaign of hatred. They said, the report says that there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictatorships and blocks democracy and development because we want to make sure we control their energy resources. And it went on to say that the perception is pretty accurate, and furthermore, that's what we should be doing, following the guiding principle that as long as the population's controlled by the dictators, everything's fine. Right after 9/11, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, did a poll among wealthy Muslims, the kind of people it cares about, people, directors of multinational corporations, wealthy professionals, people deeply embedded in the U.S.-run system in the region. And they wanted to know what they thought about the 9/11 attack. Reactions were pretty much what the National Security Council described in 1958. They said that there's anger in the region about U.S. support for dictators, for U.S. blocking democracy and development. And by 2001, there were more specific complaints. One of them was about the murderous sanctions on Iraq, which murdered literally hundreds of thousands of people, strengthened Saddam Hussein, and forced the population to rely on him for survival, probably saved him from the fate of other dictators we support. That didn't get much of a ripple here, but in the region, people notice when hundreds of thousands of people are slaughtered by a brutal and harsh sanctioned regime, U.S. of course. And the other thing by then, not in 1958, was U.S. support for Israeli occupation, terror, and violence. Well, that's after 9/11 among wealthy Arabs. You can imagine what the reaction would have been if they'd done a broader poll. The same was true of the Iraq War. The Iraq War, you should remember, was undertaken with the expectation that it was going to increase terror. That's the expectation from intelligence agencies, including the CIA. More material has come out recently from the Chilcot hearings in England. England's actually carrying out an investigation of the build-up to the war, which we're not. And the counterpart to the CIA released information that the British government was aware, and the CIA was aware, that the attack was likely to increase terror. French intelligence, others said the same thing, as did many specialists, and it happened. In fact, more than was expected. Terror the year after the invasion of Iraq went up by a factor of 7 using U.S. government statistics. That's quite a sharp rise, even more than was anticipated. Actually, there's a dramatic illustration of that that's taking place right now, of the doctrine that, the Muashar doctrine, that as long as the population's under control, everything that's fine. Yeah, I'm sure you've been reading about WikiLeaks. The big, exciting revelation, the one that got all the headlines, was that the Arabs support our policy towards Iran. Well, maybe true or not, but notice what they were referring to. They were referring to the Arab dictators. The Arab dictators, they claim, support our policy. And that's the way the press covered it, and that's the way commentary was. A lot of self-adulation about the fact that we're supported by the Arabs. Well, as it happens, just a couple of weeks before that, the Brookings Institute, major institution in Washington, had released a poll taken by a leading U.S. polling agency, which has been conducting polls in the Arab world for many years.